Greetings all! Okay, it's been a while. I've been kept quite busy with my various other jobs, not least the military. I spent pretty much the entirety of April in what was then known as Fort Hood, sitting in the planned cell of 3rd UK Division. I don't know why I'm always at the back of these photos. It's a form of height discrimination, I am sure. Anyway, they're an extremely capable group of people. I guess when you only have one division, you can afford to be quite picky about who you put into running it. It also helps to be embedded into a group where even the general officer commanding quotes Blackadder during meetings. A very civilized and cultured crowd, and a good learning experience for me. No, I'm obviously not going to talk details. I've a link below to the Ministry of Defence's article on the matter, and I love how they put sick after 1st Armoured Division due to the spelling. But to summarise what is publicly stated. Basically, the exercise itself is called a Warfighter, which is a simulated war game. The scenario was an Article 5 conflict against a peer power in Eastern Europe. For those who are inside the war game, they are in effect in the war. So they receive reports from lower or issue orders to lower. They report and receive orders from higher as well. On the other end of the radio, from the division headquarters or the corps headquarters, brigade commanders and their teams are actually the ones in front of the computer screens playing the war game. Everyone higher than that only gets what they are fed, so there's a curtain. Everybody in the division headquarters gets to play, from the logistics guys counting bridge modules to the public affairs and psyops guys dealing with the media, Twitter, the EW folks trying to figure out how to achieve their goals. It's far more than just moving units around on a map, and it's a hell of an exercise. Winning or losing isn't the point. It's designed to be basically impossible, otherwise it wouldn't be a challenge to learn from. An interesting point about the MOD article is that the British General is referred to by first name as Major General James. It's a bit of an oddity, but British lieutenants, captains and majors are on a first name basis with each other without even the rank. But higher than that, it's still first names, but with the rank. So I'm Colonel Nick to the Brits, whereas to anybody in the US Army, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Moran. It was good to meet some of you watching this, and I apologise if I didn't have the time we would really have wanted to chat, and my regrets to those I didn't really get to talk to at all. But unfortunately, though I may take a light-hearted attitude to my work, I was still there to do a job, so we'll just have to link up again at some future point. For the record, I was in the French Division headquarters 2 years ago, and so I've got a fair basis for comparison. Sadly, I expect I shall rotate out of my position before the next exercise. Other news, my book is on sale again. New cover, but generally speaking the same book. I'm also opening up the t-shirt sales. See link in the description. No new shirts this time around, no new designs, just reissues for other folks who managed to miss them last time. So that intro done, on to the questions. Starting with Alexander H. Can I elaborate on the German heavy tank doctrine in World War II? I'm not sure quite what you're looking for, as it's reasonably well covered. The idea of a heavy tank to defeat enemy defensive lines goes back in German terms to at least 1937 and the Durchbruchswagen concept. However, the general bypassing of defensive lines and almost entirely mobile warfare for the first couple of years of the war meant that the Germans didn't really miss them. Although I know it would probably have been a bit of a wake-up call that maneuver sometimes isn't the only answer. In any case, the purpose of the German heavy tank was to clear the way for the rest of the force. It would have the armour necessary to survive while it sought out, in particular, anti-tank guns and tanks capable of engaging the lighter German armour. These heavy tanks would be placed in battalions at army level, and then they will be able to be distributed to subordinate units as necessary. The first proper manuals for their employment were released in May 1943 on the basis of experience provided from the first couple of battalions fielded, but they all generally come to the same conclusion. Attack in the first wave and destroy enemy targets at ranges beyond effective return fire. Those targets would preferably be enemy heavy tanks. Of course, there's theory and there's practice. If an attack was planned and a Tiger battalion was available and ready, it would be a very effective spear. However, The guidance to higher echelons included a statement about giving Tiger units time to rehabilitate after an action, or else a compounding effect of maintenance problems would result. Well, when they started using Tigers as the firemen of the Eastern Front, guess what happened? If you haven't seen it, hop back about 4 years to my video entitled A Controversial Opinion on Tiger. Bonbon vert. What do I think of the Israeli Nagmachon? Not much, but it does fit in with the Israeli penchant of getting absolutely every last bit of use out of equipment. There are those who consider Nagmachon to be the first heavy APC, although I do wonder if the Ram Kangaroo shouldn't earn that title if the Mark 9 doesn't qualify. So if you think of Nagmachon as a Centurion Kangaroo, you won't be far off. You start with a Centurion hull, modify the area around the turret to take troops, and away you go. Nagmachon was the improved version, which gave the troops inside a little bit more space and protection as they dismounted. There is no back door in this vehicle, remember. Eventually, they modified the vehicle to have a large tower, for lack of a better term, greatly increasing the vehicle's silhouette, but also its field of vision. As a heavy APC design, Nagmachon and Nagmachon left a lot to be desired in the dismounting safely realm, and the T-55 base Achzaret was a far more suitable use of old hulls for the role, with a rear hatch. Not exactly a great one, but one nonetheless. Of course, with Achzaret and now Namer, and I apologize, I made no claims to being able to pronounce Hebrew in the picture, what use was Nagmachon? With another revised tower with more glass and a couple of machine guns, if anything, they would be used for low intensity requirements instead of on the front line, although I guess I can kind of see a use for them in a sort of an equivalent to a route clearance patrol, where you don't need firepower as much as you do vision and armor. I guess an Israeli bod will have to chime in the comments below with the practical experience answer. Felicity Longus. I have to say I would be guessing if I attempted to answer the question of why there is a shift in Soviet artillery fielding from towed guns to self-propelled. I can think of various reasons, such as improvements in counter-battery technology through increases overall in cross-country mobility of both tracked and wheeled vehicles, which might leave supporting towed guns further behind. Which of these various reasons the Soviets relied upon, though, I do not know the answer. Keep an eye on the comments below, maybe somebody better read on the subject than me will respond. What's my opinion on the AGS? Was its cancellation a mistake which left a capability gap as the army has spent a great deal of time and money trying to fill since? Or was it a case of serendipitous budgeting which allowed the army to hold off on the procurement of a light armoured assault platform until technology could mature further? To answer the question of the capability gap, the first stop is probably the Manual for Light Armor Operations, FM 17-18. It is available online, and it was the doctrine for the use of the M8. If I may read from the introduction. Currently, light armor units are equipped with the M551A1 TTS Armored Reconnaissance Airborne Assault Vehicle. The M551A1 will be replaced by the M8 Light Tank, and I will detour here to note that the Army in this case isn't avoiding the term light tank for the M8 as it does with other vehicles. The light tank will be an air-deliverable, all-weather, mobile, protected, direct fire platform. It will be able to engage enemy bunkers, buildings, armor systems, and personnel in close or built-up terrain. The light tank will add a new dimension to the combined arms capability of light forces, but it is not intended to replace the main battle tank. And then they italicize the next sentence. The primary purpose of M8 light tank forces is to operate with light infantry during rapid deployment and contingency operations. They immediately provide the rapid deployment commander with an armored system that can counter a variety of threats until heavier forces arrive in theater. Initial light tank forces can be air-delivered using low-velocity airdrop procedures, followed closely by forces arriving by air-landing transportation assets. Now, if we go further down the line, the list of suitable targets starts with non-armored and ends with tanks. The actual list of tactical tasks that the M8 was expected to do once in the fight doesn't actually differ really from the M1 tank, but there are some interesting observations in the details. For example, one of the advantages listed to bringing an M8 along is that it has thermal sights to greatly enhance the night fighting capabilities of the combined arms team. Now, modern US infantry units tend to be fairly well equipped now with thermal systems without the use of a light tank. It also observes that the M8 company team or task force may find the addition of tow-equipped Humvees useful for long-range anti-tank fires, whereas the M1 of the time, well, if you can laser your target, you have a good chance of hitting it. Of course, this is also in the days before Javelin. Unlike current thinking with the MPF, the M8 light tank units could be deployed at multiple echelons, as a platoon to an infantry battalion, as a company to a brigade, or kept as an intact battalion as a divisional asset to be used as a mobile force of significant combat capability. Whereas the current thinking for MPF is that, yes, it's a divisional battalion, but only for administrative requirements. In practice, they're going to be parceled out much as the MGS was for striker units. That said, there have already been proposals in Armour magazine to give the MPF additional roles using FM 17-18 as a template. I can't say I'm convinced, especially since the manual only references the light tank being used with light infantry units, while some of the proposals recently have included using the MPF in roles such as recon in heavy armoured divisions. So, to answer the question on capability gap, I think, yes, there legitimately was a gap. The proof for that seems to me to be in the existence of the MGS and MPF. Yes, infantry have gotten more capable since, but they have also gotten more capable both on the offense and the defense. So the relative need for a vehicle, to me, seems to be the same. On the other hand, is there a need for a specific air transportable vehicle? One can observe the airlift of M1 tanks by C-17 into northern Iraq in 2003 to support the 173rd Airborne, but it's also worth noting the time delay. The 173rd jumped on March 26th, but the airlift of a small armoured unit of M1s, M2s, artillery and other supporting elements didn't occur until nearly a fortnight later, at which point the ability to land C-17s and logistics was a little bit more secure. It did not help the 173rd get that first foothold. However, that doesn't mean that the decision to axe the project was wrong. Any organization making big decisions like that is balancing risk. Yes, there was always the possibility of the decision biting the army in the ass and seeing US forces take unnecessary casualties in certain operations due to the lack of a light tank. But they seem to have been reasonably mitigated by, for example, flying M1s and Bradleys around, and justified by the fact that the low probability events where that wouldn't suffice didn't actually occur. Kazuki K. The first question is on the matter of steel wheels on wheeled vehicles, the obvious example being EBR. Well, the US tested the EBR in Fort Knox in Aberdeen. Quote, "The tractor-type intermediate wheels greatly improve mobility during cross-country operation. They are, however, too light in construction and easily damaged when operating over rocky terrain or surfaced roads." Unquote. Indeed, the US had to replace a couple of the metal wheels during testing process. It seems to me that they are more trouble than they are worth. If you're going to have metal wheels, even with rubber on the outside, you need to have a lifting mechanism to get them out of the way when you don't need them. That adds weight. If they're going to be tough enough to survive rocky terrain, they need to be much heavier. When pneumatic tires get dented by rocks, they generally just inflate outwards again. Finally, there is no provision for adjusting inflation and thus ground pressure with a metal wheel. One may lose some of the traction due to the lack of ridges or cleats on a rubber wheel, but one also increases mobility elsewhere by dropping tire pressure and increasing the amount of contact patch. Perhaps it is worth observing the little belly wheels on BRDM are also pneumatic. So even in the days before every wheel vehicle had a centralized tire inflation system, the standard wheel was considered viable. And Kazuki's traditional second question. Given my appearance on Military History Visualized, where I opined that a thermal-equipped T-55 or T-62 is generally better than a non-thermal equipped T-72, if you only had a single thermal to retrofit, would you put it on an autocannon-equipped IFV or on a tank? I would still go with the tank. It's more survivable, so your thermal may last longer. And the tank, even the old one, is still capable of dealing with more types of threat. And the third question, given that you're a dipstick for missing Q&A 26. Do I see room for a return to self-propelled anti-aircraft artillery with fast autocannon, given the glowing reports of Gepard from Ukraine, both in the anti-drone and anti-infantry roles? Well, I think that's going to depend a little bit on the finances of the country in question. The US is taking delivery of proximity-fused 30mm for use in its Stryker Dragoon and Leonardo DRS counter-UAS vehicles. But this is considered an interim solution. The typical US solution to a problem is often to throw technology and thus money at it. And testing with laser-based or electronic attack-based systems is showing much promise. If you can't afford that though, the next best option is definitely the smaller caliber, so likely 57mm and under, proximity fused cannon round, which is certainly cheaper to procure, but the ammo costs will surely add up over time. And I can't really think of any other options. Missiles are simply cost ineffective to use against most drones. It's worth noting the recent RUSI report, which states that Ukraine is losing about 10,000 UAVs per month. Now granted, it doesn't say how many of them are intended to explode and are thus categorized perhaps instead as guided munitions. The report also states that one can expect 2 to 5 UAVs operating over any 1 kilometer sector of the front line at any time. And that is a lot of targets. The effectiveness of the autocannon against ground troops seems to be a bit of a fringe benefit. The army should already be well enough equipped to deal with that sort of problem, and there should be plenty of airborne targets to shoot at anyway. Thus, the ineffectiveness of the high-expense counter-UAS systems that the US is looking at in the long term against troops seems to be a bit of a minor point. John Rayberger, also on the topic of the importance of thermal imagers. How good are modern thermals? Can you tell the difference between a T-64 and a T-72? Or is everything just a sort of a Soviet tank-shaped blob? A modern flare is far more capable than a 1980s era thermal imager. At battle ranges, it would indeed not have been particularly easy to distinguish between an enemy T-72 and an enemy T-80, for example. On the other hand, back then it probably didn't matter. Nobody on your side was using Soviet tanks, so if you could tell friend versus foe, that was good enough to pull the trigger. However, note the amount of fratricide which still happened in Iraq, indicating that even telling friend from foe in the thermal is not always easy, let alone get into the details. As you can imagine, real-world AFVID imagery presented to your eyeball is a little bit more difficult than the simple images of full tanks taken on a good day for the AFVID class. A modern flare is going to give you a lot more fidelity. So observing the position of the spotlight, what side it's on, or the size of the wheels, or the number of driver's periscopes, it's actually going to be far more feasible at combat ranges than it used to be. There's a reason why we're spending so much money on these things. And not just for the vehicles. There are plenty of other hotspots that one needs to distinguish in the forest woodlines. Adam Schindler and John also ask a follow-on about the modularity of future vehicles and the ability to plug in upgrades. And contrary to Adam's thinking that maybe it's a dumb question, it actually is quite a notable one. You will notice, for example, that the Crows on an M1A2 is operated with a second control handle next to the commander's override. One would think it will make a lot of sense for there to be a simple toggle, that the handle controls either the turret or the caliber 50. But it's actually not an easy thing to do. So like, imagine you have a computer which runs Linux, but you want to add a printer which was designed to speak Windows. Oh, and a scanner over there which speaks Mac. As a result, the Army has put out a bus architecture standard, It's apparently causing a bit more hassle and expense, and providers are having to rework their systems so that they're all compliant. But the end result should indeed be a far greater modularity and compatibility of components than we used to have. Caleb Engelhardt: have I considered writing a second book? Yes, but I just don't have the time to do it. As you may have observed, I don't have the time to keep up a consistent release schedule on YouTube as it is. I have a cunning plan, but it's probably going to have to wait until one of my other jobs goes away. It seems unlikely that World of Tanks will sponsor reprints of other Honeycutt books, by the way, but they are all available from Echo Point. S-Face: would deception tactics similar to the US's World War II Ghost Army or by Yugoslavia against NATO work in the modern era? Absolutely. The US Army does have deception gear and doctrine, and we assume other nations do as well. You're kind of like, we've blown up 23 of the enemy's 24 mobile bridges, but we have to assume a number of them are actually plywood, so let's keep hunting. For obvious reasons, the details are not widely advertised, but the general doctrines are publicly available. See, for example, FM 3-13.4. Also, I mentioned before that it is rather a dangerous assumption that the Army will always have air superiority over a combat zone. Does the Army train for situations where the skies are not so friendly? Short answer, yes it does. You've got to give those divisional anti-air planners something to do in those Warfighters, for example. Everyone gets to play. Sean S: during World War II, King Tiger, we're back to that again, was considered by many the strongest true tank of the conflict. However, the vehicle had a host of issues. If the tank had been given a proper engine, transmission, suspension, etc. for its weight and bulk, do I believe a reliable King Tiger could compete on the battlefield with post-war tanks? His vote is that it likely would be okay until the late 1960s. I'm sorry, this is a silly question. If the Centurion had been given a 105mm gun and fire control system, which it eventually received, would it have been able to be more effective in Germany in 1945? Sort of an odd hypothetical. It seems to me that overall the strongest true tank of the conflict was the IS-2 anyway. It was already reasonably mobile, reliable, and it had an even bigger gun with good armor. Yet it wasn't really particularly viable after the 1950s, with the beginning of the proliferation of T-55s and Centurions, again with that 105, so I don't see how King Tiger would have made it. Matt Wetton: Challenger, for better or worse, has become the UK's tank of choice for probably the next half century. Do I think Challenger 3 is worthwhile, given Britain's drawdown of its tank regiments, ammunition issues for the rifled 120 notwithstanding? Well, yeah. If you're going to have any tanks at all, you might as well make them the best possible that you can. Though I and others in the industry are a little bit bemused by the fact that though they are building an entirely new turret, they're keeping it a 3-man turret crew. The three options are basically major upgrade, minor upgrade, or bail and move to an entirely new tank. Minor upgrade was not going to be suitable due to a combination of increasingly rare ammunition with limited upgrade potential and a few other issues. Bailing and moving to an entirely new tank would probably cost more money. So it does seem to be the most practical solution. Although I would hope that they decide to upgrade a few more than 150 or so that they've announced, so that they have a good attrition reserve or an expansion capability. Josh Conti would like my life story, which is a bit more than I think I need to go into right here. But the last question was, why did I move to the US? Remember, I was born in the US. I'm an American citizen from California, although I live in Texas. The search for better weather, more money, and bigger guns. When I moved back to the US, I didn't actually have any particular location in mind, and I was starting to get job nibbles from Atlanta, RTP, and San Francisco. It was January of 2000, and I was staying with a friend of a friend in New York City while I was waiting to see which way I would go next. Well, as I was passing time, I had the TV on as background noise, and there's absolute rubbish on during the weekdays around lunchtime, and at least in the year 2000. So I had the Weather Channel on. The Super Bowl was on in the Georgia Dome in Atlanta that week, and the weather forecaster comes on, and here I am in front of the Georgia Dome and a foot of snow has landed. Now bear in mind, my knowledge of Atlanta was my knowledge of Georgia was basically what I saw in the Dukes of Hazzard. So I didn't think it snowed in Georgia. Apparently it does. And then I had to think to myself, well, hang on a second, I've been to RTP. That's further north than Atlanta, isn't it? So if it's snowing in Georgia, it's probably snowing in North Carolina. And then 10 minutes later, sure enough, here I am on the intersection of I-40 and I-440, and 3 feet of snow, the worst snow in 10 years have landed. Nope. 10 minutes later, I'm reporting from San Francisco, and as you can see, it has rained. Bear in mind, this is the second week of January. Guys are still wearing short sleeves. They got umbrellas, but it's short sleeves. Yeah, I'm going there. John Cryer has a question about different track types, which I need to add to my ever-increasing list of things I owe an answer to. But dead versus live track has absolutely nothing to do with the rubber or metal track blocks. That comes down to traction on roads versus off-roads, and to answer Adam's question, the answers for additional grip are basically grousers or even snow chains. I promise it's an easy enough question, so I will attack it soon. Teku. When was what we would eventually call crew ergonomics considered as a serious design factor? What was the first tank which took it into account? In the beginning, I suspect that the designers weren't in much of a position to be picky. I would think that the first sacrifice to crew ergonomics was moving the engine to outside of the crew compartment into a separate compartment. By World War II, what the US would call human factors were certainly a consideration in evaluation, although I'm not sure quite how hard and fast the criteria were. I mean, were they make or break issues? Certainly, as I looked up some 1930s reports, the 1932 assessment of the T2 convertible combat car indicated a requirement to raise the steering wheel by at least 3 inches to give the driver a more comfortable position. Or in 1934, to give the combat car T4's gunner a seat with additional 3 inches of range of adjustment. For those who haven't seen it, by the way, I have an entire video on the Christie type tanks that the US trialed. The idea of being able to be operated by the X percentile of people, however, I don't seem to have encountered before the 1960s. That's not to say it wasn't a criterion before then, I just don't seem to have encountered it in the archives. To this date, the percentile criterion is still used, though there have been observations that your typical combat soldier tends to be a little bit larger or more muscular than your typical private citizen, even before adding in bulk added by equipment. So maybe these standards need to be changed just a tad. Anyone who has ridden in an RG-31 can probably relate. On a related note, Teku also wishes to know if the Sentinel is still the worst turret, ergonomically, I've ever been in. No. It has been overtaken by the Stridsvagn M42, which does not suit the typical tall Viking of Swedish lore one iota. Yes, I get that Sentinel was a 3-man turret, vice a 2-man, but the Stuart is probably not the best case for comparison, not when far more comfortable 3-man turrets existed for the British cruisers. And even Matilda's was better than Sentinels despite a very small turret ring. Similarly, in the early war period, Panzer III and IV figured out turret space quite handily. The T-28 actually. And then, being built in 1942, Sentinel is going up against Sherman production, so I'm not inclined to give it very much leeway on account of it having a 3-man turret crew. Reichsbeer Minister. Why do I think that a drone operator on an individual tank is a bad idea? Was there ever a case in tank combat history of information overload and consequential failure in the field? Not to my knowledge. But the problem is that you have a 4th man in the tank, requiring a volume of space which needs to be protected to do something which doesn't require the man to be sitting in the tank to do it. That's a different matter to the question of information overload. The desire of a tank commander to see drone footage, for example, does not require that the drone in question be controlled from within the tank. The drone is already transmitting a signal to the operator, so the information is going to be about as useful if it's controlled by the guy in a Jeep 1 terrain feature back as it is for the commander to just patch into the signal and see what it is that the drone is transmitting. Now, there are arguments for tethered drones which don't require an electromagnetic signature and cannot be jammed, but they are pretty much by necessity only for local security purposes or just looking over obstacles to provide a little bit more vision, and they can be programmed for orbit or maintenance of station relative to the operating vehicle, so they don't really require an operator either. And don't forget, there is a very serious effort in various industry circles to use AI to aid in information processing. It's about the only way that we will ever get down to having a two-man crew in the long run. Yes, they're looking at it. Robert Henry Ilston. As a unit commander responsible for many tanks, did your second in the tank have more autonomy to deal with immediate threats because your situational awareness may be for the whole unit and not just the tank? Are these concerns resolved doctrinally or by each individual commander? Well, I guess it's commander driven and it's based on his assessment of the situation and his crew. Commanders do tend to be given the better gunners. For this reason, however, it's accepted that he might be a little bit busy controlling his company, battalion or brigade, and it's a little bit more important than observing sectors of fire or fall of shot for him to do. Yes, Brigadier accordingly commanded 7th Armoured in 1991 from the TC's position of his Challenger. In this, the British theory of having the loader being the second most senior man in the tank does have a little bit of merit. He has the best observation of the other three and is thus he's going to have the best overall situational awareness, even though he has no gunner's optic. However, the fire process of a gunner-initiated engagement doesn't take all that much effort. The gunner screaming "identify tank" and up from the loader is probably going to break the TC's train of thought anyway, and a judicious fire and adjust command from the TC basically hands the engagement over to the gunner as it is. Plus, the reality is that gunnery standards be damned, an instruction that if you have to shoot right the hell now, don't wait for me, is pretty realistic. The one thing that the gunner can't do, though, is just pull the trigger on his own. He still needs to let the rest of the crew know that he's shooting, just for their own safety. Mike Quinton. If the army is getting rid of the MGS, how can other countries deploy wheeled gun systems for years? Well, the army's gotten rid of MGS not because there was no longer a doctrinal need, but because it was proving too difficult to keep in service. Being designed as it was to meet C-130 airlift criteria with the infantry support role, they were trying to cram a lot into a small package, whilst wheeled main gun vehicles like Centauro or Type 16 don't have the same limitations. It looks like they asked the system to just do too much for the engineering ability of the time. It will be interesting to see if MPF is brought in to fill the role, or if, when Stryker eventually gets replaced, a new MGS will be built with whatever that common new chassis is going to be. Thunderchild. In the MPF video, I asked if the MPF had track commonality with the Bradley. What factors go into determining just how well the tracks of one vehicle would work for another? It seems like most countries would want to have a few common tracks for various AFVs to ease logistics. I agree, that would be a fair thing to see. I have not seen a set of criteria to help determine such a requirement. It seems that the balance is between contact area with the ground, and thus width, to result in an appropriate ground pressure, weight of the track, as wider track is heavier, so it adds both to the overall weight of the vehicle and to the weight that the engine has to drag around the suspension, and the ability of the powertrain to overcome the friction of all the linkages. Quite how that balance is made, especially with consideration for procurement costs of spare parts and multiple logistics lines, I have no clue. And on the note of tracks, what music do I enjoy? Mainly, I'm tuned into the 80s and 90s station on the car radio, with frequent forays into the rock and country stations, and occasional hops down to 70s, new wave, and Irish. FDXR. Merkava suspension. It looks like Christie. What did the Israelis do other than mounting it to the outside instead of the inside? Well, if memory serves, the Israeli springs are multiple concentric and they also have a shock absorber on each wheel. I'll try to find a picture. But yes, they are very similar in general concept to Christie. But actually, I always wonder if they're not similar in general concept to Churchill, but beside the point. Also, had the invention of effective high-velocity heat shells occurred early in World War II, would heavy tanks still have happened? No, probably, yeah. If a heavy tank is vulnerable to heat, you can imagine what non-heavy tanks are vulnerable to. The existence or not of heat is irrelevant to the other threats on the battlefield. It's not an either-or sort of proposition. The tank still needed to be capable of withstanding a 4 cm or 5 cm shot in order to increase its survivability in battle, regardless of if a 75 mm gun firing heat might have been around. USA, USA! Why did the Soviets put a fixed hull machine gun on the T-54? You know, it's a damn good question, and I'm not sure I've ever seen a satisfactory answer. The fixed hull machine gun goes back quite a few years. Look, for example, at the M2 and M3 mediums and lights, which were all built with them. Even early Shermans had them. After the war, they continued to hang around. Witness the IS-7 and some T-54s with externally mounted fixed MGs. I can only assume it was a compromise between the suppressive effect of another machine gun and the unwillingness to place a sufficiently large weak point of a bow gun, let alone the waste of space of a bow gunner. I am open to education on this one. So apparently is Peter Samsonov over at Tank Archives, who is one of your go-tos for Soviet armor, because I asked him, and he doesn't have any documentation explaining the thinking either. Saskia, in tank video games, autocannons seem to have a significant advantage over single-shot ones. The theory he has is that an untrained and unorganized force or unit is more effective with autocannons. Can this apply to the real world? I don't think so. You're running an apples to oranges comparison, as the two guns are intended for two different roles. I can see the advantage to putting better trained people in the main gun-equipped vehicles simply as an economy measure. You probably have fewer of them, and each round is more expensive, and you want to make them count. But fundamentally, it's a matter of proper training. Note that some militaries, such as the UK's, will place new recruits straight into the gunner's position. If you give an untrained gunner an autocannon, all that will happen probably is he will waste more little rounds as opposed to fewer big ones. But at least an autocannon does have a suppression effect, and he could get lucky. Grim. How do you manage a logistics situation like you see in Ukraine without putting all your logistics people on some sort of a self-harm watch list? That is a damn good question, and I am sure the folks at the US Army's Logistics Center of Excellence will have some interesting research papers to publish at the end of this war. The obvious thing to do, and this has been done since at least World War II and arguably the US in World War I, is to separate them out by unit. So, for example, at the main receiving point for foreign aid, split it up by NATO and non-NATO standard, and then subdivide from there. As much as possible, have brigades or at least battalions using single standard munitions. So if you have one infantry battalion using M4s, one using G36s and one using FNCs, then the entire brigade only needs one type of rifle ammunition. Whilst in, let's say, the next brigade over, all the rifle ammunition can be 5.45. You can do the same thing with supporting artillery, vehicles, pick your poison. Where it starts getting difficult is to mix at echelon level maintenance. So let's say a mech infantry company has a maintenance section attached to it. These are usually small teams that can probably only deal with one or two types of vehicle. You don't want to mix at that level. A division support battalion, or whatever, might have two maintenance companies. So you can have one trained in Western equipment and one in Eastern. And this is thus not beyond reasonable to have a mix of equipment in the division. If you change source of supply, take a unit out of the fight to re-equip and retrain. Militaries have a fair bit of experience of this. For example, it was not uncommon in World War II for British units in particular to go through a number of these refieldings. You do have to have the breathing space though to be able to afford to pull a unit out of the line to do this re-equipping. It's not just a matter of expertise, it's also a matter of shipping space. A unit is going to have a certain amount of spares on hand, as they know that there's going to be some items which routinely break. So, if you only have one type of vehicle, you only need to have a single spare Whatsit on hand. If you have two vehicle types, you need to have two Whatsits on hand, one for each type. Every time the maintenance section moves, you need to drag both of the Whatsits around, so there has to be the cargo capacity at the appropriate echelon as well. When it comes down to keeping track of the individual items and ordering them, as far as I'm concerned, it would just be another NSN in the system. There may be twice as many in the system, but still only one number to plug into the requisition form for each. A Russian widget is probably about the same size as an American widget, so the act of getting it from A to B is not really a determining factor. It's really about the storage and the knowledge on how to use it. It seems to be a relatively simple problem, per se, for the Ukrainian logistics guys to keep up with, if they have the man hours available to update all the parts in the database and to cascade all that information down to receiving units. Laurentis, is there a difference in number of killed tanks and crew survivability between petrol and diesel-powered Shermans? Not statistically significant anyway. Most fires were shown to have been related to the ammunition stowage. And if the fuel tanks were burning, it will be in the engine compartment anyway, so also not a significant factor in the burning of personnel, even if the anecdotal reports of being less likely to catch fire were true. Oshin Kreener, I have previously told how General Devers and a galaxy of generals crashed in neutral Ireland in 1943. In reality, they were held only briefly before being released to some protests from Germany. If they had, in fact, been interned for the duration, who would have taken over the duties, and what impact would it have had on US tank development from that point onwards? By the way, there's an argument for a galaxy to be the collective noun of a group of generals due to the number of stars present. It is an unfortunate reality that though we like to wax poetic about how great this general or that admiral was, all officers are replaceable. Their replacements may have a different way of getting to the same result, but there's little reason to believe that they wouldn't be overall as good. Generally speaking, idiots don't get placed in senior positions in the US Army. They tend to be weeded out by the mid-levels. In terms of Devers, however, a hypothetical long-term detention wouldn't really have had much of an effect. The crash happened in January of 1943, and in May of 1943 he was selected for command in Europe. To a very large extent, the various major decisions in terms of armour force structure and equipment which Devers made had already been made by 1943, and there wouldn't have been all that much of huge significance done between January and May of that year. The decision to make the 76mm the standard Sherman type hadn't been made by May, and though Devers was not enamoured of the idea of making T-23 variants with 90mm guns, the decision was made by early May anyway. So overall, the major effect would probably have been the question of who would have run the various other commands that Devers held afterwards. He is one of those underrated generals, proving capable both in the training force structure side of the house and in field command. He commanded 6th Army Group, an equivalent position to Bradley or Montgomery. Eventually he was placed in McNair's old slot as head of Army Ground Forces. However, if it weren't him, well, it would have been somebody else. One could say the same for General Brooks, who ended up in charge of 2nd Armoured in Normandy, and General Palmer, who commanded 7th Corps Artillery in the European campaign, and they were also briefly interned in Ireland. Barnes is a more interesting proposition, as he was quite involved in armoured vehicle development for the remainder of the war. Actually, he was involved in development in a whole slew of things, mostly good. But we'll keep it to armoured vehicles for now. He was a huge proponent of the T-23 medium tank and basically drove its acquisition through the system, with the result that the US Army ended up being saddled with a couple hundred of the things, which ended up proving to be nothing but technical demonstrators and an argument as to how not to procure tanks. He was also a major driver behind the arrival of the T-26 into theatre. If it weren't for his badgering, it probably wouldn't have arrived by the end of the war. If that's a good thing, is an arguable proposition. There were rational reasons why he was opposed, and the overall effectiveness of the tank on the conduct of the war overall is pretty small. On the plus side, Under his watch, the E6 Sherman came into being. But whether that was his idea or a subordinate's, I cannot tell. Interestingly, the Green Books don't seem to indicate who was his deputy who would have taken over the role in the event of his enforced absence, but the list of other department heads, which does identify, indicates that Ordnance had a number of very smart people working for them. He pushed a few other things through as well, which in hindsight he was correct on, such as the T-71 M36 tank destroyer and the M41 self-propelled gun, neither of which was particularly in demand by the using arms. The T-71 program was a matter of record as of March 1943, after the crash, Barnes pushing for the system to be mass-produced when able, as was his way, with TD branch and the engineers only saying it should be developed for the sake of having it available in the back pocket in case it became needed. The conclusion to the Ordnance Green Books is interesting though, in that it states that the further away you got from Ordnance Department, the more balanced, or at least less unanimously positive, the impression of Barnes became. Nobody doubted that he was a genius, but there were accusations, somewhat supported I would say, that he'd become obsessed with what he could do at the expense of working relationships with other parts of the service or international allies. So had he been replaced, it's quite possible that some US vehicles may not have seen service as they did, but on the other hand, perhaps other vehicles or modifications may have entered service which did not. It is of course impossible to prove such a counterfactual. Pirate Skinnier. What is my opinion on Cold War and post-Cold War French tanks and the cheese-eating surrender monkey mantra? Well, the latter is entirely unfounded. I have never yet come across a French soldier who didn't want to fight. Whether the politicians let them or not is another matter entirely. As for the vehicles, well, they certainly had their own design philosophy of small, light and mobile. Okay, we'll ignore the ARL-44, which is a bit of a left turn. The AMX-13 and the 100mm AMX oscillating turret tank were both sent to the US for trials. The 13's agility was considered praiseworthy, but the human factors test, i.e. ergonomics, did not go well. The driver's position failed entirely, with only 1% of US crewmen able to fit into the driver's seat comfortably, and those who did would suffer back pain. Even fewer US crewmen could sit in the TC's position to standard. The worst position was the gunner's station, which met US human engineering standards only in seat padding and elbow space. The test did note though that different horses could be suited for different courses. Quote, the French, it seems, are willing to live with restrictions in crew selection to smaller individuals. The United States is not willing to do this. Therefore, it may be unfair to compare crew station design with US military human engineering standards. It notes that for export sales, if other countries do not follow the same 5'8" height limitation, some, possibly much, degradation in crew performance can be expected. The 100mm tank didn't fare all that well either. Fire control, vulnerability and reliability features of the French tank are unacceptable by US standards. So they did do better with the AMX-30, which joined with the more or less contemporary Panzer 61 in having a 2cm coaxial autocannon. I have no particular opinion on the tank other than it seems to have done the job required. There was a proposal, the AMX-32, to basically fit it with a new turret capable of fitting a 120mm gun. The successor vehicle to that, designed for export, AMX-40, is kind of an AMX-32 in concept with laminate armour. Due to lack of sales, it was as much a technology testbed for Leclerc, but it continued to retain the 2cm coaxial. Note that the more or less contemporary M1 was originally being considered with a 2cm coax as well. And of course the predecessor vehicle, MBT-70, also had a 2cm on board. It was a thing back in the day. They dropped it down to just caliber 50 in Leclerc though, which I'm told is an utter pain in the ass to reload every time you fire a few bursts. These days in particular, with a caliber 50 remote weapon station, it seems like a bad idea. Otherwise though, I have no particular opinion for or against Leclerc, never having been inside one or even seen one in motion. I must assume it does exactly what it says on the tin, and I appreciate the French being the launch customer of using autoloaders in their MBTs, a position I fully support. Knight. What did the Germans have to say on the idea of Panther being a heavy or a medium tank? Well, dragging down my Jensen Doyle to have a look, there is no indication that the Germans considered Panther as a category other than tank. The fact that they were not placed in schweres Abteilung indicates that they were not considered as heavy tank. So if tank, absent any other adjectives, equals medium, well then that's what the Germans considered it. Arnakela. Given that the ground-based air defense situation in Ukraine is essentially curtailing or neutering air power, do you think that the NATO armies will realize that assumption is the mother of all screw-ups, and assuming that they will have friendly skies and thus no need for AA assets, will finally be rectified? Or would NATO air forces not be concerned with the Russian ground-based systems? I presume you have to add Chinese or Korean or anybody else we want to be going up against. Remember, air superiority or air supremacy for one side is not necessarily related to air superiority or supremacy on the other. It's a relative condition, a bit like defeating the enemy is a relative condition. You can be defeated as well overall, even while you defeat them. I think the Soviet emphasis on ground-based air defense systems was a realization of the fact that it was unlikely that they would obtain anything other than local air superiority, and that airspace denial would be satisfactory. Which is fine. Remember my old video from a few years ago on this subject. It's called air defense, not air destruction. If you can keep enemy air from interfering with your forces, you've done your job, regardless of what your own air force can do to the opposition, or even if you manage to cause any damage at all to yourself. By yourself, to them. It's worth observing that during the NATO campaign over the former Yugoslavia, NATO never claimed to have air supremacy under 10,000 feet. There were still way too many ground-based air defenses. Now that did not stop NATO operations, but it's an example that even the distinction between air superiority and air supremacy can be further subcategorized. It will be a very brave enemy pilot to try to attack US Army units in the face of the US Air Force, even if US Air Force tactical air were unable to effectively strike enemy ground units because of their defenses. However, in the era of drones, air defense as a branch is suddenly back in favor. So ground-based air defense systems for that job are definitely something that modern militaries need to spend a bit of money on. See earlier discussion. Wrecked cars. Was there any attempt to fit an armoured vehicle with a 37mm Oldsmobile autocannon from the P-39 fighter? Not that I know of. It's too big for smaller vehicles like the Stuart, and even the T-16 was too big for that role. As I recall, the Oldsmobile 37 was also more of a slower velocity, reliant on explosive charge for the damage against the aircraft. If you're using the explosive capability, and the 37mm mount is the same size as a single-shot 57 or 75, just use the bigger gun. Sebastian Cranen with an organizational question. Does US doctrine normally emphasize the platoon or the company as the main fighting element for tanks and mech infantry? 4 tanks are harder to lead as a singular unit with a company-sized assault than are 3, but they can be split into elements when the platoon is engaging in tasks on its own. In Sweden, we run 3 tank platoons because we always fight in companies. Also, with the move towards the new US Army mech infantry company with 2 platoons of 6 Bradleys, why not make 4 platoons of 3 instead? Second question first. If you're not tracking the Armored Assault Company, which is basically the new mech infantry company organization, I have a video on that. The 6 Bradleys was arranged on the basis of properly supporting a standard infantry platoon. The current 4 Bradley platoon doesn't have enough seats for dismounts, and the sections are kind of weirdly split amongst the vehicles. To get a full-strength standard infantry platoon around the battlefield, with additional spots for medics, JTACs, or whoever else might be attached, they needed 6 Bradleys. So 3 Bradley platoons would in reality only give you an infantry section each on the ground. As to the first question, the standard tactical formation for the US Army has always been the platoon. Anything above that becomes combined forces, be they company or battalion. It is expected that many companies in combat would become company teams by swapping infantry and tank platoons. So an armor company team would have 2 platoons of tanks, 1 of infantry, whilst an infantry company team would be 2 platoons of infantry with the tank platoon sent over from the other company that took the 1 infantry platoon. Now they don't have to be task orged like that. There are times where the battalion commander might like to leave the units as homogeneous. I'm not sure I understand the argument about how 4 tanks are harder to lead as a singular unit though, because you only have 2 sections, which isn't that hard for even a lieutenant to grab a hold of, whilst the company commander now only has 3 major subordinate organizations to control. If you have 4 3-tank platoons, you end up with the platoon leaders having fewer options, but the company commander now has 4 units to coordinate instead of 3. There are all sorts of other arguments over the 4-tank versus 3-tank platoon. A 3-tank platoon is supposedly more efficient, as there is less chance of a platoon double tapping targets. But on the other hand, if you lose a track, well, you've lost a third of your firepower, and your platoon is suddenly much less potent, whilst losing 1 out of 4 tanks still leaves you with a very viable platoon. There are also other arguments like more eyeballs and sights for a platoon sector, if platoons are detached a little bit from the company. Anyway, matters of national doctrine, I guess. Right, that is it for now. I hope you found it all interesting and informative. I will talk to you on the next one, probably relating to tracks. Take care.